Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we'll be asking how much money can Hong Kong's law firms earn by listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Now, most law firms in most jurisdictions worldwide are not allowed to list because of professional rules and because of legislation and regulation in place. They are not allowed to list on a stock exchange. In this infographic and the Hong Kong Lawyer article on which this infographic is based, we ask what would happen if Hong Kong's law firms were allowed to follow the road pursued by law firms in jurisdictions like Australia and increasingly the UK. This infographic comes from a Hong Kong Lawyer article in which we argue that unlike the US and the UK, that law firms in Hong Kong face distortions which have caused local firms to lack the capital needed to compete. We argue that foreign law firms have been so successful in Hong Kong because they have access to capital in their home market jurisdictions that Hong Kong companies have not had access to. And therefore, to rectify this distortion, listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange could help provide the resources that these local firms need in order to balance the scales, as it were. Now, turning our attention to the infographic, we see three major trends in the data which are useful for understanding the paper. The first trend is that only two of the firms that we have listed out of the top 10 firms are classified by the sources we use as local Hong Kong firms. So that suggests that a lack of local firms in the top 10 suggests there's some kind of distortion. Either there's a capital market distortion, there's a regulatory distortion, there's a labor market distortion, or a combination of these factors, which makes the playing field much less equal to homegrown talent. The second trend in the data are that there's probably consolidation waiting in this industry. And I base this observation only by looking at the difference in revenue across various law firms and similar patterns that we see in other jurisdictions. In other jurisdictions where there are lack of fetters in terms of industry consolidation, we see revenues following what's known in the industry as a power curve or following the mathematical power law. It's also known as the Peter principle or the 80-20 principle. That is where 20% or even 10% of the firms earn up to 80 or 90% of the revenue. And that's simply because size confers certain advantages. And we don't see these effects in these data. Just eyeballing the data, we see that revenues are relatively equal across the largest Hong Kong law firms. And that suggests that if some of these fetters were removed, we might see a fair amount of consolidation and revenues would follow a power curve which slopes down very quickly from the upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner. And we would see the emergence of some winners and far fewer large firms in the top 10. This leads, of course, to the third factor, which is that combined, if there were a couple of very large law firms that won in this game, if you will, combined, we would see law firms that are attractive enough for investors and that are on a similar scale as transportation companies, large finance companies, and so forth. So consolidation in the industry might not only help Hong Kong's law firms compete, particularly on the mainland, but might offer more attractive alternatives for investors looking to put their money into Hong Kong firms. This has been another infographic instant with Brian Michael.